I'm sure we can all agree that it's not really a stretch to assume that an NBA player had a favorite team of his own growing up, right? So it's only natural to also assume that they had a team they absolutely hated growing up as well, which was probably more than likely their favorite team's rival. In this video, we're about to go through 8 NBA players who despised a particular team growing up for whatever reason. That is, of course, until they became one of them. If you were to guess which NBA player D'Angelo Russell grew up idolizing, it would probably take you a while to guess Manu Ginobili, but that is the right answer. Ginobili was D'Angelo's favorite player as a kid. Russell would always watch clips of Ginobili when he was younger, and his goal was to emulate his game after his.
Did you have any players that you looked up to or try to model your game after growing up?
Definitely. First, I would say Manu Ginobili. Just his passing ability and his thought process throughout every game.
So as you can imagine, playing against Manu for the very first time was a surreal experience for him. Reportedly, during his rookie year, Russell approached Ginobili at the free throw line and said, "It's a pleasure to be out here with you." It must have been great being somewhat of a San Antonio Spurs fan like D'Angelo was growing up, simply because it seemed like they won the championship basically every other freaking year around that time. However, it wasn't always so peaceful in the Russell household, because on the other hand, D'Lo's brother grew up idolizing Kobe and the Lakers. So in theory, that would mean that things between D'Lo and his brother would get heated every time the Spurs faced the Lakers in the playoffs. Of course, Russell would root for his favorite player Manu Ginobili during those battles, while his brother was pulling for Kobe back in those days. And he had no idea that D'Angelo would one day end up playing with him. Russell was selected 2nd overall by the Los Angeles Lakers in the 2015 NBA draft. And now that he was on the same team as Kobe, he had no other choice but to side with him.
Kobe or Jordan?
That's hard, man. That's a lot of pressure.
Okay.
If I wasn't a Laker, I'd say Michael Jordan, but now that I'm a Laker, I'm gonna say Kobe.
You would think that LeBron James growing up in Akron, Ohio would automatically mean that he was somewhat of a Cleveland Cavaliers fan on some sort of level, but that wasn't exactly the case. In fact, he didn't even really like the city of Cleveland itself, and he explained why in an interview he did with GQ magazine back in 2010. James explained he's always had an uneasy relationship with Cleveland because he's from Akron, a half-hour away. It's not far, but it is far, James said, and Clevelanders, because they were the bigger city kids when we were growing up, looked down on us. So we didn't actually like Cleveland. We hated Cleveland growing up. There's a lot of people in Cleveland we still hate to this day. But in an ironic twist, the Akron native wound up becoming the Cleveland Cavaliers' greatest player ever. He was actually more of a Chicago Bulls fan growing up, due to his admiration for Michael Jordan. But instead of getting to play for the Bulls, he got to constantly kick their butt in the playoffs as an alternative. I want you guys to imagine being a diehard fan of one particular team growing up, but when you finally make it to the league, you end up playing for each and every one of their rivals instead. What I just described was pretty much the life story of Rajon Rondo. When Rondo was a kid, he was absolutely obsessed with the Detroit Pistons, and Isiah Thomas was basically his hero, wanting to be just like him. But on draft night in 2006, he would receive what was at the time bad news. He initially got selected by the Phoenix Suns 21st overall, which I guess was okay with him. However, he would get traded to the Boston Celtics immediately after, the very same team his Pistons used to go to war with. That must have felt pretty weird, but obviously he didn't have much choice but to make the most of it. And lucky for him, he got to taste what it's like to be a champion fairly early in his career, having to go through his Pistons that same year in the Eastern Conference Finals to get it done. Once upon a time, he expressed aspirations of wanting to be the greatest Celtics point guard ever, which was far from the dream he once had when he was younger. He never thought those words would ever come out of his mouth, but they did. He almost got the opportunity to play for Detroit back in 2009, but the Pistons decided to not do the deal. He also eventually would go on to play for the Chicago Bulls as well as the LA Lakers, two more teams his Pistons constantly went up against in the playoffs. Of course, he's had to have gotten over it by now, but I'm sure he would have liked to have followed in Isiah Thomas's footsteps, or at least tried to, if that's even possible, if given the choice. Speaking of Isiah Thomas, he also was forced to join the enemy. If you didn't know, Isiah was born and raised in Chicago, so of course he was a huge Bulls fan growing up. So much so that he took desperate measures to make sure he was drafted by them.
So I'm a Midwest boy, and I wanted to go back home to Chicago.
Right.
And Mark Aguirre and I both were trying to, rig the draft. We both can get to Chicago. So every interview we did, with the teams that were above us.
Right.
We just blew the interview.
He would go on to say that when he had an interview with Detroit before the draft, they knew he was purposely trying to bomb the interview and told Isiah that it wasn't gonna work and that they were gonna draft him at number 2 no matter what. And sure enough, they did. Here's Isiah on being viewed as a villain in Chicago. It bothers me some because I grew up a Bulls fan. I was one of those little kids standing outside Chicago Stadium begging for gym shoes. I used to get popcorn out of the dumpsters when they threw it out late at night. I got Jerry Sloan's size 15 shoe. Bob Love used to come up to the boys club. Growing up a Bulls fan, then being drafted by Detroit, that was tough because we understand what the Chicago-Detroit rivalry is about. In football, basketball, and hockey, but my job was to beat Chicago, and I did. Like he said, it was difficult for him all of a sudden being viewed as a villain in Chicago, but as time went on, he essentially said screw it and embraced the villain role.
But all I know is, head to head, Detroit, Isiah, better than Chicago.
Right.
Oh, I'm
Isiah.
Also, his personal feud with Michael Jordan didn't really help the matter either. He wanted to be what MJ was to them, but had to build his legacy in Detroit instead, the team he grew up hating. Moving on to the younger Isiah Thomas, for lack of a better word, he was a diehard Laker fan growing up.
My dad had bought me a Lakers warm-up, like the full warm-up, the top and the bottom. He brainwashed me into being a Laker fan at a young age. And I probably wore that once a week for a few years into school.
And his dream of playing for the Lakers would ultimately come true, but not before playing for their rival first, the Boston Celtics. And that's actually where he would thrive the most, becoming an all-star. He received a lot of love when he was in Boston. Yeah, I'm sure if he was given the choice, he would have rather made a name for himself in a Laker uniform, but the fact that he shed a few tears during the tribute video the Celtics made for him shows that they will always have a special place in his heart. I mean, you don't cry for no reason. Joakim Noah's dream as a kid was to one day play in the Big Apple. He was a big-time Knicks fan growing up, and just like the majority of Knicks fans, he absolutely despised the Chicago Bulls, and he made that perfectly clear during his pre-draft workouts. Reportedly, he went out of his way to make it known that he was a diehard Knicks fan, and that he hated Michael Jordan. He really wanted to let the Bulls know that for some reason, possibly as an attempt to discourage them from taking him, but unsurprisingly, that didn't stop them from selecting him 9th overall in the 2007 NBA draft, where he quickly became a fan favorite. He would eventually go on to play for the Knicks after spending 9 years in Chicago, but that turned out to be a disaster to say the least. I mean, hey, even though it was a disaster, at least he got to be with Derrick Rose again for that first year in New York. If you think about it, it was almost like their situations flipped. Initially, Joakim Noah was forced to endure playing for the team he hated growing up, while Derrick Rose had the privilege of playing for the team he loved growing up. However, all that changed in the summer of 2016. This time, Noah finally got the opportunity to play for his hometown team, while Rose had a hard time dealing with the fact that he was traded to the Knicks.
What's up, B? You lying. You serious?
He was clearly heartbroken by the news, but surprisingly, not too long after, Rose came out and said that he received more love from them than he ever did from Chicago. Yeah, he actually said that, and seems to be doing just fine in New York to this day. So even though he, without a doubt, rode for Jordan and the Bulls as a kid, and dedicated his heart and soul to them for the first chunk of his career, it looks like the Knicks of all teams is now officially his home away from home. Who would have thought? Perhaps the biggest example of a player going to the team they hated the most is Paul Pierce. Pierce grew up in Inglewood and was a massive Lakers fan growing up in Southern California. In his own words, he bled purple and gold, but in an ironic twist, he got drafted by the enemy in 1998.
You grow up in LA, Laker fan your whole life,
Yeah.
and end up a Celtic.
I know.
What was that, like?
I was like, man, I'm in now. I don't care. I don't care if I play for the Celtics, even though I hated them growing up. I'm in.
He would also say, I have a Lakers sweater I used to wear every day to school. It was a hoodie. How could you not be a Laker fan? I grew up right down the street from the Forum, right there in Inglewood, watching Magic. I hated the Celtics. You from LA, let alone Inglewood, where the Forum is, of course you're a Laker fan. How could you not be? So that's what makes it real ironic when I was drafted to the Celtics. And what makes it even more ironic is the fact that the 2 times he went to the finals, it was against none other than the Lakers both times. He would go on to become one of the greatest players in franchise history, and ultimately watched as his jersey number went up in the rafters. Alright guys, I know there are a lot more examples of this, but I feel like this video is long enough. Comment down below if you enjoyed, and of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.